Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying summer school this week. I actually took part last year and I found it a really enriching experience, so I hope you're finding the same. I'm really thrilled to be invited to speak about shadow heroes today and also present the case for translation as a powerful and creative means to build a fair education system. So Shadow Heroes is an organisation which supports young people in embracing all sides of their linguistic and cultural heritages. And we do this through creative translation workshops in schools and training for literary translators. And these workshops explore issues of representation, self-expression, colonial history, and also the relationship between language and power. We believe that all young people should feel like they belong. We believe in educational spaces which value all languages. And we believe that using and learning languages can be a way to think critically and creatively about the world. Collaboration is at the core of what we do, and so we work with a collective of 14 brilliant translators, writers, poets, and other artists who translate with 16 languages, which include Arabic, Bissau-Guinean, Kriolu, French, German, Gujarati, Hebrew, Hindi, Indonesian, Japanese, Polish, Portuguese, Punjabi, Russian, Spanish, Turkish, and Urdu. So together we demonstrate how the ways we use language can reinforce or challenge norms of power. Our workshops help young people think critically about what they read, watch, or listen to. They encourage questioning, boost confidence in young people's own stories, experiences, and skills, and respect for those of others. They foster curiosity, intercultural understanding, and they also employ a range of media, so music, film, graphic novels from around the world. But the point I'd really like to focus on is why translation? What is it about translation that makes it such a powerful educational tool? So translation is a site of plurality and a prism through which we can examine the world and our position within it. It's highly political, subjective. It foregrounds how our ideas and perspectives influence the way that we read and interpret sources. It's creative, it's challenging, it's an active process of negotiation, and also a responsibility which requires conscious and critical engagement with the politics of representation. So in an educational setting, especially at secondary school, translation is most commonly used as a supposedly neutral method to train grammatical competencies or creative writing skills. But the political dimension is regularly underplayed or sometimes ignored entirely. So our work at Shadow Heroes harnesses both the creative and the disruptive power of translation in an education setting. And as Don-Mi Choi, the writer and translator, points out, the goal of translation or poetry is to upset the language of power. So I'll illustrate what I mean through some examples from our workshops. Okay, so the first point I'd like to make is that translation can encourage us to think about the relationship between languages. So not all languages are valued equally in society, and this is something which is internalized by young people at schools, where the focus on Western European languages and elite forms of English creates a perceived hierarchy, which means that certain languages are valued over others. Learning languages in specific silos, so where French and Spanish and German don't speak to each other, has the effect of framing languages as bounded entities rather than fluid, complex, or dynamic. So we highlight the complexities of language through our source material. For example, the writer Sema Kaigasuz talks about her novel Every Fire You Tend, which was translated by Nicholas Glastonbury, in an interview published in Pen Transmission. So she says, I'm not a Muslim writer or a Turkish writer. I call myself a Turkish language writer. And this is not a homogenized language. It includes Arabic, Greek, Farsi, Spanish, Armenian, Kurdish. If you speak with a Turkish nationalist, you realize that they don't speak real Turkish. They don't know Turkish, just a very narrow version of it. The Turkish of Every Fire You Tend refuses this. So translation can not only teaches us foregrounds the relationships between languages, but also encourages us to think about the relationships within language. So our workshop, Translating Political Satire from Egypt, is led by Dr. Reem Abu Al-Fadl, who's a translator and senior lecturer in comparative politics of the Middle East at SOAS. So this workshop captures the richness of Arabic, its formal form and diverse dialects, and asks students to translate a satirical song by protest artists from 1970s Egypt. So in this workshop, students tackle challenges of how to render irony, ridicule, parody, caricature, and also discover how satire in popular culture can amplify mass grievances. So translation can also challenge the desire to converge on a coherent or easy story for a country society, and equip students with a toolkit for engaging with difference. So for example, the workshop Electric Guitar Jakarta is run by Khairani Baroka, who's a writer, poet and translator. And this workshop has students embrace multi-sensorial modes of learning and creation in their translations of the song Aku Cinta Jakarta by Common Lennon. It provides a viewpoint on Indonesia that's against dominant orientalizing frameworks and against essentializing culture as monolithic. So Indonesia is a really important example in this respect, as it's home to hundreds of languages and cultures. So translation is also a way of knowing and understanding a tradition. So Jugni goes to the UK. Translating Punjabi Jugni is a workshop led by translator and writer Kavita Bhanot. Through interrogating how Jugni is used in Punjabi music, students come to understand that the meaning of a word is not fixed, but rather reflects context, perspective, ideology, audience, readers, and instead of giving answers, this workshop shows how a word can be interpreted in different ways in different contexts. So translation can encourage us to see the layers and complexities, look deeper, and also reflect on our own processes of interpretation. So translation also enables a richer understanding of history. So A Luta Continua, translating Portugal's colonial past, is led by writer and translator Jovanka Pachechi Perdigão. So in this workshop, students see how history can be constructed, assembled, edited, erased, and written for a purpose. It's therefore not necessarily comfortable, fair, or inclusive. So students discover Portugal's colonial past through songs and translation. They discover what Crioulo, which is a language spoken in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, can reveal about Portugal's colonial history. And by comparing two contrasting accounts of the colonial experience in Portuguese Africa, and translating two songs, one from Portuguese and one from Bissau-Guinean Crioulo, students learn to appreciate why history matters and why it matters who gets to write it. Finally, translation is all about collaboration and creative play. So through our collaborator collective and through our teaching methods, we encourage students to embrace values of non-judgmental co-creation, mutual respect, and dialogic relationships. So they work together through solutions, reflect on assumptions, and also reframe the way they view difference and relate to each other. So our workshop, Keeping Your Eye on the Dragon Ball, is run by Yuka Harada Par, and it's all about translating Japanese anime. So students compare Japanese and American film trailers of the same film and discuss the politics of dubbing and how dubbing into English often relies on Anglophone stereotypes of Japanese culture. So in groups, they translate the trailer for Dragon Ball and also record their own dubbed version. So just to sort of conclude, I strongly believe that translation can provide us with a formative education, a rich source of learning. It can be a prism through which we examine the world. It can make us self-reflective, improve our critical thinking. It can teach humility, highlighting how much we still have to learn. It can teach us ethics, solidarity, and social responsibility, and it therefore is, for me and for Shadow Heroes, an essential educational focus and an essential life skill. Thank you for having me.
Hello, my name's Charlotte Ryland, and I'm really pleased to be giving this talk about translation in schools on behalf of the Stephen Spender Trust and the Queen's College Translation Exchange. So I run two organisations that have translation at their heart. The Stephen Spender Trust is a charity that was founded in the late 1990s and that over the past years has come increasingly to focus on using translation as a way of encouraging young people to engage with other languages, to value the languages that they have, and to engage with international culture. And then in 2018, I set up the Translation Exchange. That's based at the Queen's College, which is a college of Oxford University. And I set up that with the aim of harnessing the energies in universities to fulfil that same mission that the Stephen Spender Trust has. So encouraging young people to engage with other languages and cultures, to encouraging them to value the languages that they have and to engage with international culture. Both organisations have creative translation at their heart. I don't think I need to go into much detail about the creative side of translation in this talk. Those of you who are attending the summer school will be absolutely aware of the inherently and brilliantly creative nature of translation. Nonetheless, it is a bit of an issue for our work with schools because the modern languages curriculum in recent years has brought translation back onto the curriculum but turned into something that can be assessed or that needs to be assessed using kind of rigid mark schemes. And so that sense of creativity has been lost a little bit on the curriculum. Nonetheless, I will take it as read that the idea that translation is a creative act is very much understood by this audience. And instead, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about the why, the what, and the how of creative translation. Why we do creative translation in schools, what it is, and how you as translators can get involved. So to start with the why creative translation, I need to go back to 2009. One of the things that I love about translation in schools is that it really responds to a need. It's not an activity that's kind of plucked out of the ether, but it's a genuine and necessary response to circumstances and to concerns. And in 2009, these were the circumstances. The UK was enjoying increasingly multilingual classes in schools, in particular in primary schools. But not much was being done to address that change, and in particular to acknowledge that multilingual setting as an asset, not just for those who spoke other languages, but for everybody in the classroom. It wasn't being widely celebrated and shared, recognised as something that can contribute to creativity and literacy, rather than a deficit that requires remedial action. Around about the same time, the Stephen Spender Trust had launched a poetry competition, the Stephen Spender Prize for poetry translation, and it was starting to make a difference in schools, but the numbers accessing it in schools were still relatively low. And it was clear that this idea that literary translation could enrich the education experience of all young people wasn't really cutting through to schools. The final thing that was happening is that this was 5 years into a big change in modern languages education in England. So in 2004, languages had stopped being compulsory at GCSE, which meant that schools were no longer required to offer a languages education beyond the age of 14. And it's generally accepted that this led to a significant decline, or rather accelerated an existing decline in the numbers studying languages, and which is still being felt nearly 2 decades later. So that's a kind of a gloomy picture, but there was something positive happening at the time as well, and that was happening in the literary translation community. that community was becoming more numerous, more visible, more collaborative, and more activist. Again, I don't think this is something that I need to go into detail. For this audience, just the very existence of the British Centre for Literary Translation really reflects what a vibrant and active community is, and it is, and the fact that you're all watching this does too. So all of these circumstances in around 2009 came together with the Stephen Spender Trust launching its first Creative Translation in Schools programme, which is called Translation Nation, and which brought translators into what were called at the time super diverse primary schools in East London. The translators spent 3 days at the school with the children, sharing and translating oral stories from around the world that had been collected from parents, grandparents, neighbours, and so on. They worked together in groups to translate, and there was a performance and a sort of X Factor style competition at the end of the 3 days. Translation Nation was the brainchild of 3 people in particular, these wonderful people that you see on your screen now. Sam Holmes, who at the time was a teacher and researcher in sociolinguistics, then director of the Stephen Spender Trust, Ravina Pelham-Byrne, and superstar translator Sarah Ardit-Soni. And if you're interested in finding out more about this work, I'd really recommend a couple of articles that Sam Holmes wrote at the time about the impact of creative multilingual activities on young people, and also on a chapter that Sam and Sarah have written in this book, the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Education, which came out a year or 2 ago. Their chapter is called Translators in Schools Valuing Pupils' Linguistic Skills. Translation Nation went on to develop a strand for secondary schools. And in both the primary and secondary, the potential for cross-curricular activity became really, really clear, and that's something we're still working with. The feedback from teachers, pupils and translators was extraordinarily positive for Translation Nation and the projects that followed. And I've just picked out a few quotations here. A Polish boy new to our school got a chance to shine in his home language, a great start for him in our community. A Hungarian girl who rarely speaks, even one-to-one, said a line on stage to the whole of Key Stage 2. Now you can see there the really beneficial, really quite powerful impact that this had on those children who speak languages other than English. But the one I want to highlight is this one, which talks about 2 Somalian children who wouldn't admit that they spoke a language other than English until they took part in the project. By the end, they were correcting people and directing people in speaking their language, which was great for them and also for the rest of the class. So the reason that I highlighted this one in particular is because of that final sentence. It was great for them and also for the rest of the class. And I think that really sums up the power and the impact of creative translation that we found over the past 10 plus years, is that it is a brilliant way of turning these multilingual settings into an asset for the whole community. And in some respects, it's even more valuable for monolingual pupils than it is for their multilingual peers. So it became clear that there was something really special going on in classrooms, and we've been reflecting a lot recently on what exactly that is that's happening when creative translation happens in the classroom. One of my mottos for this work is this concept that you can see of showing, not telling. And I think this is particularly relevant for a languages classroom. So rather than telling pupils that having a language will be exciting in the future, that it will enable them to get a better job, that it will enable them to travel, we're showing them right now in the classroom what a rich and exciting experience it is to be a linguist. And also that being a linguist doesn't mean being a walking dictionary. It means having facility with language, being able to engage with other languages, even if you only know a word or 2. And then the other way I've started to think about it recently is these 3 concepts of content, culture, and community. So creative translation brings rich and meaningful content into classrooms. It brings cultural and intercultural experiences to young people, and in particular, it's multilingual culture. And thirdly, it makes those young people explicitly part of a community of speakers of other languages, which stretches through the generations and across the continents. And I'm starting to think that it's that sort of combination of experiences that is really where the power lies in this work. So, as I said, special things happening in schools, and the next stage of the Stephen Spender Trust's work was to start to consolidate and then develop further this activity. And this is where the programme Translators in Schools came in, which is probably, if you've heard of this work, the programme that most of you have heard of. This was a programme to train translators to design and deliver workshops for primary and secondary schools. And in order to do that, Sarah and Sam developed a sort of scheme with templates and models in order to make it possible for translators to develop their own creative workshops. We've started to think about that model in terms of what you see on the screen now, of a 3-stage model: decode, translate, create. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, giving an example in a minute. But I think the reason that we're sort of codifying in this way is that we're finding it demystifies the process a bit, and it makes it much more accessible to translators and teachers who are coming to this activity for the first time. So this brings us into phase 2 of this talk, the what. What is creative translation? When I think of Translators in Schools in particular, that programme, I think of a picture book workshop. And I think in particular of this one that you can see on the screen here, which is a workshop working with a book called Little Red Hood by the French writer and illustrator Marjolaine Leray and translated by Sarah Ardizzoni. As it's just an awesomely illustrated book, as you can see, and really brilliant for this kind of work because the pictures are extremely expressive. So this is the Translators in Schools picture book model in a nutshell. Starting with decode, the young people are given the pages of the picture book with no text, so they're focusing only on the pictures. They have to figure out the mood of the story. They have to figure out what's going on. They can really play with ideas and play with potential order of the story. And what they're doing there, of course, is they're decoding the pictures and they're decoding they're translating the pictures. Then the text is added in, and that's where we move on to the translation section. And we give them a glossary so that they can decode that, in this case, French. And of course, what results there is a kind of clunky mess of awkward English phrases. And so at that point, the glossary is ceremoniously dispensed with, ideally by ripping it up and throwing it in the bin, which you can see happening in the bottom corner of your screen. And that then sort of frees up the participants to move on to the create phase of the workshop, where they work together to turn that clunky English into something beautiful and flowing, something that reflects that original mood of the text. That's, as I said, a sort of nutshell of a workshop. There are then lots of ways of extending this kind of workshop. They can, for example, choose a different mood and decide that they're going to rewrite this story with a different mood, a different tone, set in a different country, take a poem and set it in a different century, reimagine it for a different audience. There's all sorts of ways of kind of taking that translation one step further, but it still all fits into this quite neat and easy to remember model of decode, translate, create. Again, if you're interested in finding out more, I'd really recommend the Translators in Schools film. We have 2 versions of this. One is 3.5 minutes long and one is 7 minutes long. And that shows in particular some of these picture book workshops in action. And it has some really beautiful responses from the children taking part. It's clear when you watch it and when you listen to them that they're doing something that they hadn't thought was possible. They're having fun. They're thinking carefully about language and how it works. They're thinking about their audience. They're modifying their message for their audience. We often talk about this as fantastic literacy training, which it absolutely is, and that's how it can fit into a curriculum. But it's clear from watching that film that it's so much more than that. So, talking of the curriculum and teachers, this takes us on to the next stage of the what of creative translation, which is the current phase of our work. So as Translators in Schools developed, it became clear that if we really wanted to broaden the impact of this work, then it was going to be necessary to empower teachers to run activities like this in the classroom when there isn't a translator present. And that inspired our current project, which is an umbrella for a lot of different projects, called Creative Translation in the Classroom. And it was at this point that I joined the Trust. So I've picked out sort of 4 strands of creative translation in the classroom here. Firstly, translator-teacher partnerships, whereby a translator and a teacher work together to co-develop and co-deliver workshops and activities to pupils. As it turns out, this is something that's worked particularly well in the pandemic because the translator doesn't need to be in the school in order for that partnership to work. Secondly, we've been developing virtual resources. Again, this is something that we started before the pandemic, and much as we don't like the reason for the massive increase in virtual activity over the past year, it has been really interesting to see the impact of a move further towards the virtual. The reason we started thinking about developing virtual resources pre-pandemic is because we really wanted to make this activity as accessible as possible and to make sure that wheels were being reinvented at an absolute minimum, that not many wheels were being reinvented, by which I mean every time a translator or a teacher wants to do some creative translation activity in a classroom, we wanted to make sure that if they wanted to, there was something for them to build on, that they weren't just starting with a blank slate. And thirdly, we're really focusing on integrating the Stephen Spender Prize into what we do. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And finally, we're partnering with universities to support and advise them on outreach and impact activities with schools. And I think the best example of that probably is a translation exchange project called Creative Translation Ambassadors, where we train university students to go into schools and run translation workshops. And one of the really nice things about that is that it enables the students to use what they're doing at university, which is often reading texts, watching films, thinking about them, talking about them, translating them. It enables them to take that activity and bring it to young people, and really young people. I mean, it starts at the age of sort of 9 or 10 and goes up to 18. I've just got an example here of one particular strand of our virtual resources, which is a database of texts and resources associated with the text. So this is, again, going back to that idea of not reinventing the wheel and having blank slates. We wanted to make sure that there was a growing database of books and poems that we know work well in classrooms, for which we provide worksheets and sometimes explanatory videos. And you can see here our collaborator, Rahul Berry, in the corner of this video, talking his way through a picture book workshop. And then we also have, we're also publishing virtual poetry booklets in as many languages as we can, which provide ideas for pupils who want to enter the Stephen Spender Prize, and also material for teachers and translators to use throughout the school year. The Stephen Spender Prize then, which is kind of where all of this started, has become the focus of everything that we do, in the sense that the prize happens towards the end of the school year. So it opens in May and closes in July, and so it means that everything that's happening during the school year can be leading up to this final opportunity to take part in a national competition. Over the past couple of years, we've also developed a new strand to the prize, which enables us to focus in particular on languages that are spoken widely throughout the UK. So we had a Polish spotlight last year. We now have an Urdu spotlight, and that is curated by the wonderful poet and translator Sasha Aurora Akhtar, who you can see on your screen. And then next year we have a Romanian spotlight. think the other handy thing about the spotlights is that it's really helping us to partner with and engage with organisations where those languages, in communities where those languages are particularly spoken, and an example being that we're partnering with South Asian Heritage Month, which is happening in July and August this year on the Urdu Spotlight. Okay, so that was a fairly whistle-stop tour through the why and the what of creative translation as we see it from the perspective of the Stephen Spender Trust and the Translation Exchange. I'm moving on now to the how, in the sense of how you as a translator can get involved in our work. And what I've done with this slide is I've collected together all of the roles that I think translators are carrying out now in these projects. So the most obvious one, and the one that we started with, if we think back to Translation Nation that I started talking about, is workshop leader, workshop designer, of course, resource developer. So we're now developing resources, translators working on developing resources and not necessarily then going and delivering them to young people, but making them available virtually. CPD facilitator, so working with teachers on their continuing professional development. Judge for competitions. Alongside the Stephen Spender Prize, the Translation Exchange has launched a new competition this year called the Anthea Bell Prize. No, the Anthea Bell Prize for Young Translators, excuse me. The Anthea Bell Prize for Young Translators. And we've got around 600 schools participating in that this year, which is far more than we expected and kind of really shows what appetite there is for creative translation in the teaching community. This is a bit of a longer one. Work with universities on impact and outreach projects. This is something that we're really developing at the moment. We're working with two projects in the English department at Oxford University at the moment that have sort of workshops and projects in schools, advising and consulting on that. And then finally, the translator is peer supporter. So as much as possible, the collaborators that we work with, we encourage them to work together and to support each other as they design workshops, develop resources and so on. We have a wonderful small team of collaborators who carry out all these roles at the moment, and you can read about most of them on our websites. Okay, so those are ways that you as a translator can get involved really quite actively in the work that we do. More immediately, do follow us on social media, take a look at our websites, and subscribe to us on YouTube. You can join our mailing lists to keep up to date with our work. Despite all the activities that I've just described, both the Stephen Spender Trust and the Translation Exchange remain very tiny organisations with very small teams of largely freelancers. And we're reliant on funding from trusts, foundations, universities and school partnerships to make our work possible. The Stephen Spender Trust isn't an endowed organisation, despite what the name might suggest. So if you're able, we really welcome donations to the work of the Trust. But the most important way that you can get involved and support right from now is to join in our advocacy work. It is a really, really exciting time for translation in education at the moment. It feels like there's a massive sea change going on. There's huge potential. People are really opening their eyes to the possibilities that this brings, to the experiences that young people can have in our communities. And it feels like quite an urgent moment for that as well. The more that we can all shout about the benefits of the work done by the Stephen Spender Trust, the Translation Exchange, Shadow Heroes, and work by other colleagues, the more the field will grow. And as it grows, the opportunity for you all to go into schools, to develop virtual resources, to partner with teachers, and to add this brilliant string to your bow will grow too. So I've talked a bit about formulae today. And so I'm going to leave you with one of my favourite quotes from our co-founder Sarah Arditsoni, which is in the form of a formula, and which I really think goes to the heart of why we're all doing what we're doing and what we stand to gain. Language journeys plus creative literacy plus affirmative language learning equals global citizens. Thank you very much for listening.